Hello, 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 and welcome to the very first publicly witnessed webinar. The first attempt we had was last week with our chairman, Edward Bentle, and that ended with him having to go to hospital. And we wish him all the very best this evening as he recovers, and we hope that nothing so untoward happens to my friend John. John Drori, our guest this evening, and the first webinar live guest, is a trustee, ambassador and board member of more great organisations than you can shake a stick at. In fact, his CV is so long it would probably take the whole show to read it up. At the moment, I can tell you he is on the board of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, Cambridge Botanics, the Woodland Trust, the WWF. Previously, he was on the board of Kew for 9 years. And of course, he is a trustee on the Eden Trust, our very own trust. He is also the best-selling author of last year's humdinger of a book, Around the World in 80 Trees, about which I hope he will be speaking later. It's been translated into 26 languages, and I intend to ask him to name all those languages in a minute. He's a man of many parts, almost all of them working, and in a previous life he was the inspirational driver of the BBC's digital presence in education and science. He commissioned more than 50 primetime science, engineering, business and photographic series and documentaries. He's won 28 major awards and, get this, 4 BAFTAs. In short, he is a polymath, a national treasure, and an all-round great human being. We are delighted to call him colleague, friend, and fellow traveller with a passion for trees and so much else. May I present to you my friend, John Drori.
Do you know, a lot of that was true, but not all of it. I mean, it's a bit embarrassing, you know. So I'm not a trustee of the WWF, I'm an ambassador for them, and I haven't won 4 BAFTAs. They went to all sorts of big teams that I happen to be associated with, so, you know, steady.
I'll quit the Oscar speech. I told you he was self-deprecating. He's always been self-deprecating. God. Anyway. Why are we in our kitchens? Well, John is in his kitchen and I'm in my kitchen because actually we both like to be in each other's kitchens at the same time, because we decided to have these kitchen conversations because the Eden Project and the Lost Gardens of Heligan before that were kind of gestated through conversations with lots and lots of people, a bit like John's BAFTAs. They are the summary of an awful lot of smart people talking, weaving ideas late into the night with a glass of wine. And we wanted to somehow capture that spirit this evening by having the sort of conversations which aren't that formulaic, but actually show the inner workings of enthusiasm. And where we're hoping to go and why we've started this is because Eden is about to start its great venture, which we call rather unoriginally Eden 2.0. But what we mean by that is that we're going to create a campus on site which is going to look at the living systems around us and how knowing about that may lead us to answers about the way we can live in the future in a much more constructive way. John is our first guest for several reasons. The first is, of course, that he's written a book about trees, and I have a passion for trees and want to hear him talk about that. But the real truth is his background in terms of the way he was seduced into looking at the natural world, I think is a wonderful place for us to start the story, if you like, of where the Eden Project would like to be. So John, I wonder whether you could give us that sort of personal story of how you came about your enthusiasms, that journey that leads you to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we get a lot from our parents, from our families, and one of my earliest memories, in fact, is my, well, 2 things. I remember my parents taking me to Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, in southwest London, near where we grew up, and they used to feed my brother and me bits of the plants as a way of sort of getting us interested in what those plants were and the stories behind them. And I remember one of them was Dieffenbachia, which is actually very poisonous. And I remember the sort of pain of this in my mouth. And I mean, it was only a tiny scrap that my dad gave me. And him telling me the story of slavery through that through that plant and that story. Because it was something that had been used as a sort of punishment plant in the deep south of the USA. I think that was when I was about 9. And about the same time, I remember he gave me a lick of an opium poppy, which was quite exciting, mainly because not for the slightly numbing effect it had on my tongue, but mostly because of the effect it had on my teacher when I told her. And I remember a great piece of rhetoric from my mum on the doorstep as the social worker arrived, which was, it's opium. What's the harm in that? But one of my very earliest memories, in fact, my earliest memories of anything was when I must have been about 5 or 6, and we were in Petersham in Richmond Park, and there was a tree that we always used to look at, a great big cedar of Lebanon, and I remember passing it, this time, and we went out of our way to have a look at it, and it had been struck by lightning and was being sawn up. I mean, it had obviously died and it was a wreck. And, I remember being terribly upset by this, but more than anything, I remember my father crying. And it was the first time I'd seen my father cry, and he'd had a difficult time and a difficult life. And I suddenly came to this sort of realization, without being able to articulate it as a sort of 5 or 6 year old, that that my father, who I thought was in benign control of everything, actually wasn't. And I remember my mother saying there was a whole world in that tree. And I didn't really sort of understand what she meant, because I took it just literally at the time. And she was right, there is literally a whole world in that tree, but also metaphorically there is a whole world in that tree. So I think that's what set me on my journey.
Gosh, because your mum was passionate about looking, wasn't she? Observing.
Yeah, she was incredibly sort of observant person. She had not a scientific bone in her body. I mean, the three, growing. I mean, she lived with 3 engineers in the family, and she was just sort of a complete blank on any of that. But she absolutely appreciated the beauty and wonder of nature, and when she died at a good old age, 87 or something, we looked in her purse and it was all full of the usual stuff, and this, which is a sort of a loop engineer's magnifying glass, which she used every day. She'd be out and she'd see some interesting flower and she'd be looking at the detail of it and wondering at the detail, and asking questions about the detail. It's very inspiring, really, to have someone sort of look in that way.
Gosh, what sort of DNA to start with, and then what happened to you? Because you've obviously taken the inspiration of your parents to the logical extreme of wanting to share your enthusiasms with others. Because wherever I look, in terms of your career, it's about generally it's about generosity and revealing things to people and institutionalizing access.
I sort of I studied engineering, electronics actually, and my main motive for doing that was I was interested in it, and it was a hobby. But I sort of mainly did it because that's what my brother did, and my father was an engineer, and therefore we knew I could get a job and all that kind of thing. I didn't come from a wealthy family, so that was a thing. And it was only after I was actually at the BBC, being an electronics engineer, that I thought, there's grease paint, there's lights, there's girls, there's that whole other world that I wanted in on. And I suppose, luckily I was in a place where I could start making television programs, and that kind of nerdy part of me that likes explaining things and looking at things had an outlet then.
Well, one of the interesting things I think that we've talked about in the past, not on screen like this, but is about the democratization of knowledge. So did you see that once you got your hands on the digital world at the BBC? Did you see that as almost a political thing for you to actually use it as not a weapon, but a channel to get all that marvellousness out to as wide an audience as possible?
I mean, I started off making television, and that's a very undemocratic medium, or certainly was at the time. And there were only about 3 channels, so it was even more undemocratic. And then when the web came along, I think for me it wasn't a political thing. It wasn't a sort of that. I didn't sort of think about democratization in a political way. But I thought about all the stages of education that you try and take people to, where you sort of inspire people with, to be motivated, you get their interest, you engage them, and then you need to help them get on to the next level. So you need to guide them to other resources, you need to have some kind of interaction that goes on, either in their brain or with some materials that they get. So up until the web came along, we were stymied really, because television can only do the motivation bit. If you make it very, very well, I'm not sure that I did, you can make it sort of sufficiently engaging that people are kind of interacting with it as they watch in a mental way. But all the other bits are very, very difficult to do. We used to sort of have to post people things and tell them where they could do local courses, and it's just mad.
God, the world has come on a long way since then, obviously, and it's really exciting. How do you see the future? I was reading a book recently called Bold by a guy called Peter Diamandis, who has set up the Singularity University and set up the X Prize. And what was interesting about the book was he was describing a world I couldn't have imagined even until I'd read it. And he was talking about things like Galaxy Zoo and things like this. And Galaxy Zoo, as you probably know, is this project where this guy was asked to map the stars in the heavens from all the pictures that were taken from Hubble. And he just put out this advertisement on the web saying, I've been given the best job and the worst job the world has ever invented. Can anyone help me? I've got to identify these stars. And since then, I think there's something like 400,000 volunteers all over the world have joined him to do this extraordinary bit of citizen science, which has taken us zooming into another area of understanding. Were you aware of that sort of potential when you began?
Yes, not perhaps in such a sophisticated way, but I remember one of the first projects we did at the BBC was with a kind of mood of the nation, where people could say just how they were feeling, and then we could superimpose that on the weather map. During the actual TV broadcast of the weather, there always seemed to be a depression over Manchester. But it's interesting that you talk about citizen science, because one of the things that potentially would open up with all these sort of databases and data collection is that if we did it right as a society, you could ask people, you could enable people to sort of query the database with their own sort of suggestions, like, is having a black cat connected or correlated with having asthma? Incidentally, it is. There is a connection between asthma and black cats, and it's not because of some kind of weird witchery thing. It's to do with the size of the dust particles that are trapped in the hair of black cats as opposed to other cats. They have slightly different hair. So enabling people to collect data, or then ask people to analyse data, is very interesting. And the collecting data. Astronomy really is a sort of one of the things where citizen science, it works, and it always has. And another one, of course, is natural history, because we need people to observe the natural world and find out getting the data about what's happening to different organisms and so on. So these are two areas where actually, we could be encouraging people much more. There are things like Spring Watch on the BBC, which is a phenology project, what's blooming at which time, which is actually very important, when we're thinking about climate change.
No, absolutely. Strangely enough, today I was taking part in a workshop about the natural history GCSE, which is being mooted for 2 years' time. And the reason I was on this panel was simply because I had said at a certain time, if I was allowed to do just one thing before I died, I had said, well, not jokingly, but I couldn't think how to phrase it. So what I said was, I would make sure that every single person on Earth was taught natural history, because I cannot believe that we'd be in the mess we're in now if everybody understood the cycles of the natural world. We just wouldn't have allowed it to happen.
I think you're so right. And I think one of the challenges that you or we or all our fellow travellers have is to, because I know your philosophy and I agree with it, is that that natural history shouldn't be a sort of separate subject, but should, in the way that good maths teaching or good English teaching is embedded into everything else, that it wouldn't be just its separate little kind of isolated piece, an island in the national curriculum, but would be integrated into other things. And I think that one of the hardest things that you might have in being able to sort of expand this would be to be able to persuade people that just what that might look like, to sort of give the concrete examples.
Well, I mean, we're living
to sort of give the concrete examples.
Well, we're living at odd times, aren't we? I mean, I don't know how you even phrase it anymore. We've used every cliche about weird and stuff about for the times we're now in. To me, it feels like I've fallen into a world of extraordinary ordinariness. I feel like it's almost Groundhog Day. You get up, you work. The sun is always shining. You go out, you walk by the river, you look at plants, you come back, you work, and then you go to sleep, and you repeat. It's fantastic.
We're model citizens, you and I, aren't we?
Well, no, I'm being slightly facetious, because I think one of the things that is so astonishing about them, about having some time when you're a middle-aged old fart, like, I mean, let's be honest, well, I certainly am. I won't define you as that. And you talk about what you wished you could do. Actually, having some time to think, to be able to read some stuff, and also write with a pen on paper. I've recently, in my old age, realised that pen on paper is a completely different creative act to QWERTY typing and thinking some things through, as opposed to just coming up with an instant opinion, because we live in a period of instant opinion and silver bullets to cure things and stuff. And one of the things that I've loved, I've been doing something I should have done years ago. My treat to myself was a piece of software to go and walk in the woods and photograph plants, and it would tell me what they were. And I've been going around like a kind of manic member of The Simpsons, taking photographs of plants and trying to remember everything. And then I this is a really shaming thing, John, I've got to admit, I still cannot tell the difference at this stage between a small-leaved lime and the common dogwood. And every time I get it damned well wrong, I jump up and down like an angry Homer Simpson. And anyway, I go out. But the pleasure of it, the pleasure of suddenly, the more you learn, suddenly the whole landscape around you, you start to read it in a completely different way, and you realise you've got these families of plants and stuff. So I'm building up to something here, because I know that you're passionate about trees, just like I am. And I go back to 1969, when, the age of Aquarius, we are stardust, we're all hippies, man, it's all fantastic. Extraordinary that you and I should be alive when all of that stuff, which was hippie and intuited holism and alternative, then the world of science, coming from a completely different direction, is starting to see there are emerging qualities to things like the mycorrhizal association of trees or the bacteria in us that are revealing a miraculous world, which is probably within the lifetime of us, if we're lucky, but certainly our children. We're going to find that we realise we're all made of the same sort of stuff. What do you think of that?
How could I possibly disagree? Yeah, no, there's, that... Oh, are you okay? Is it gone?
No, that's all right, you keep talking. That's all right, you keep talking. I've just done something which I shouldn't have done, and the screen has just gone blank. This shows that it's live television. Well, it's live webism, but something really weird has happened. It's really odd that the email that has come up, you know what its heading is? Disappointed. That's fantastic. Here we are. Right, you can see. Oh, did you feel a tremendous withdrawal symptom when you didn't see me on the screen?
For a nanosecond. I mean, yes, completely. So I think your question was, all that hippie stuff, may have had more than a grain of truth in it. And you've frozen. I hope that I can still be seen. But
oh no, John, come back. The interweb has failed. We'll keep talking because actually I shall tell a story which by the time I finish, John will be back and he can then match, because one of the things we've talked about is seminal moments in our lives, and I mentioned to John something which turned out to be extraordinary, because exactly the same thing had happened to him. That when I was at Heligan in the early period of the restoration of the what became known as the Lost Gardens, a very good friend of mine who's a naturalist called Peter Stafford, who then went on to become the managing director of Heligan, said, "I want to change your life. Will you give me 1 hour of your life for me to do with you what I wish?" And I said rather anxiously, "All right." And he took me down to the East Lawn at Heligan, and he pinned out 1 metre square with a string between 4 bits of wood, and he had brought a chair with him, a little collapsible chair, and he said, I want you to sit on that chair for the next hour, and I want you to stare at that 1 metre square as if the devil himself is going to storm out of it, and when you get to the end of 1 hour, I promise you will never look at the natural world in the same way again. So that's in fact what I did. I looked at this 1 metre square, and what's really odd is for the first 15 minutes I saw grass, just grassness, and then suddenly your eyes become adjusted to that grassness, and you start to see the individual stems, and you see the individual types of grass, the clovers, the timothys, the so on. And once you've got adjusted to that, you suddenly think, wow, it's a forest of green, and then you see an ant. And then that ant turns into lots of ants, and then aphids, and then all sorts of other stuff. And suddenly you realise this whole patch of grass is a complete jungle. It's just a complete jungle of things going on. And then you see a rustling in the dead grass below, and you realise there are little mammals in there. And you know what? When I got to the end of that hour, I was terrified because I wasn't sure how I could ever walk across a field again. I was going to kill so many things, but I have never thought of the landscape that I look at in the same way since that moment, and I'm very grateful for it. And I think when John finally comes back, I don't know what's happened in London, they're so far away. Technology isn't good up there, it's fine down here. Ah, John, hello dear boy.
John, you're back.
What happened? Did your cat bite through your connection?
I'd love to say that. Did you know, just I don't know what happened, but it was at my end somewhere, that in Australia there is a tree which is a parasite. It grows on other plants. It can photosynthesize as well, so it's sort of technically a hemiparasite. But basically it sends its roots out and severs, it has these sort of secateurs, and it severs the roots of the other plants and then plugs itself in. And because it uses, as a plant hormone, it uses a gas called ethene or ethylene, which is the stuff that makes fruit ripen. It's sensing that, and of course that chemical is in polythene or polyethylene, which means that it severs telephone cables, this plant in Australia. And maybe that's what happened here, but I thought that's a kind of...
Wow, there's a professional. That's like weaving. What is that kind of opportunity theatre? That's very, very good, John.
The question that you asked, I think, was about kind of the 60s, the hippie era, and these ideas sort of coming round. And I think, look, there are some things which are, just unlikely to be sort of proven by science, right? In other words, sort of holding a crystal above someone so that they get cured of cancer, that kind of thing, I think is sort of probably not going to be proved any particular time. But the idea of thinking of things in a holistic way, whether or not the 1969 hippies were doing it for the right reason or not, I think is a very sort of wise thing to do. And one of the nice examples that I came across recently was, do you remember how His Royal Highness Prince Charles got mercilessly ribbed for, the report was, I don't know if it's true or not, but the report was that he kind of talked to trees and talked to flowers. And, some people said, well, a bit of extra carbon dioxide in your breath, that's going to be good, and, and so on. But, essentially they sort of made fun of him. And I think, first of all, the idea of sort of looking after the natural world, even if it's for slightly sort of crazy reasons, is, still the motive is a very good one. But only just recently, I read a paper from a really good scientific institution talking about the Impatiens family, which are the sort of family that includes Himalayan balsam and Busy Lizzie, I think, as well. And they those plants, and probably others, but these are just the ones they've tested, they change the content of their nectar according to the buzz sound of insects that are nearby. So it goes, bee, right, you'll be wanting some of this. Moth, you'll be wanting something a bit different. Bird, maybe you'll want something other than that. and it changes, oh, butterfly, we all need a bit more in the way of amino acids. And it responds within, 30 seconds or a minute.
That is unbelievable. They're kind of like baristas of the natural world, aren't they?
Yeah, and tomatoes, tomato plants, they are pollinated by bees, bumblebees. Not just any old bees, they have to be bumblebees that beat their wings at exactly the right rate to resonate with the plant that then releases the pollen. And, a crazy thing about tomatoes is that you can delay their ripening by playing them sufficiently loud sound.
Really? Well, what retards them the most? This is going to be a testing question. What retards them the most?
Well, the paper that I read, it was in Korea, I think, that they did this, was a single tone of about 1 kilohertz, which is a sort of ooh, like that.
Oh, I don't listen to that sort of music, so that's fine. Good. God, that's really interesting. Now, when you actually switched off or went onto another planet, I was telling a story which was meant to be a double-hander between us. But what I was talking about was that we actually shared a most unusual thing, which is about the experience of looking at 1 square metre of life and it being a tremendously life-changing moment. And I was meant to speak for a very short period of time while I led to you, and as it was, I had to speak for about 5 minutes and spread out a rather thin story. So our audience is now begging for something exciting. Now, come on, go for it. Tell them something good. No, we were talking about looking at 1 square metre, and in 1 square metre of land or whatever. You were talking about forest.
I mean, that I don't know if you've read this book, The Forest Unseen by David George Haskell. That's what he does in that, and he looks at over a year, just at everything that's going on in a metre. And I think that a good exercise is to just look very closely at a plant and all the little critters around it, and and really observe, maybe just for half an hour or something, one plant, could be a tree, and sort of look at the colour, look at the shapes, and ask yourself not just sort of what is it, and how, but also why. Why has something evolved in this particular way? Leaves, when you sort of just start thinking about them, are the most extraordinary things, because if my toaster, a bit of it breaks, a bit of the element breaks, I have to replace the whole element. It doesn't work anymore, right? A bit of a leaf breaks, or a bit of an insect chomps a bit out of it. It's got what we call built-in redundancy. The rest of it carries on working. Right? It's extraordinary, that you've got something that's like, that is the size of a tree, that lives for thousands of generations of evolution of the things that eat it, and yet it survives. It's just, when you start kind of just looking and asking yourself these questions, it is mind-boggling.
That is a really interesting place to be, because I'm going to I'll give you a little bit of a breather while I formulate the question, because I'm not quite sure how to formulate what I'm about to say. But as we look at the future, there are stock phrases like biomimicry, which have a currency to do with looking at nature and learning from nature. There is also, within that whole area of cell research, the notion that I know you're very familiar with, of emergence, which is a quality that comes when things come together and an element is created, a force created that is not traceable in any of the individual parts, but when they combine, it creates something exponentially bigger. And I've always been fascinated by that, ever since reading Bill Bryson's book, History of Almost Everything, where it opens, you may recall, with a rather memorable first paragraph where he says, imagine that you are taking a human being to bits, molecule by molecule, and they're being piled up as molecules. He said, tell me please, what then is life? And that whole sense, I remember when I read that, feeling this frisson up my spine of that notion of things together, combined, having a power which none of them have individually. And I don't wish to over egg the discourse here, but I know from our conversations and within Eden, there is a notion of bringing together people of many talents to look at things in such a way that if you can combine them in a particular way, a power that was not previously observable in them can exponentially liberate things. We talked about Galaxy Zoo, we talked about things. And if we're going to have a thriving planet, do you think we need to almost take our baggage of our politics and throw them out the door and say, let's just observe really closely and live with the weft of nature? Or is that a hippie thing?
There are many questions embedded in that. I mean, I think that should we take away the baggage of politics? For God's sake, yes. Well, especially party politics. I mean, the idea that there is more, that something is more than the sum of its parts. You can look at in the slightly, religious way that you've almost described it, or you can look at it in a much more sort of functional way. And there's value in both, and probably to have both points of view, I think, is good. So if you look at a community of people and what they can accomplish compared with any one of them on their own, that's obviously special. And it's not just the number of people, but the combinations. And pretty soon, once you've got a large number of people, you have these infinite number of combinations. And one of the things that I think that people find very difficult to understand is that within the natural world, there are very complex relationships within communities where people talk about we learn at GCSE about the kind of the web of life and so on, but those webs are very, very complicated, and they're made from very, very complicated organisms that have lots and lots of other organisms within them. People are full of bacteria doing amazing things. So are all the animals. The plants have relationships with bacteria and viruses and everything else. And the danger is that people look at it so simplistically that they think, well, there's this tree and these people and they have a relationship with each other and that's fine. That we harvest this or we plant that and we get this fruit from it or what have you. And actually, it's so much more complicated, and we disregard that as our peril. And the way that I often look at it is, that sort of Tower of Bricks game that's Jenga, where you keep taking bits out, and it looks like a complete tower, and it's completely fine. But there comes a point where you can't take any more bits out, and the whole thing falls apart. And this is the danger with ecosystems, that it looks okay, and you lose this little critter, and you lose that thing, and you lose some other animal, and you lose, and pretty soon you're absolutely on the edge of what is sustainable, and you pull out one more thing, and the whole lot collapses because everything's depending on each other, and organisms can only adapt so far.
Well, I think that's really interesting because. By the way, we're getting a 5-minute warning. We've got to stop talking in 5 minutes to let people to talk to us, which is a real drag because I wish I could do that Star Trek thing and then beam you over here so we could continue this conversation.
But it's not a drag to hear from the other people. You didn't.
Sorry, I didn't mean that. Is that what I implied? Oh my dear, this is terrible, isn't it? No, I didn't mean that at all. What I mean is because it feels like the time has gone so rapidly, and I wanted to ask you and the audience that. We have this extraordinary thing, bringing us back to one of the things we share, which is the Eden Project here in Cornwall, and we're building others around the world. And we have privately shared the view that if all they ever became was theme parks, we should burn them down now and not even start. We actually want to generate an excitement and a way of looking at the world, which we hope will make people happier. And it's incredibly difficult when you do things like we do to control that waggy little finger of saying this is how you must live, as opposed to, hey, here are lots of opportunities, let's hear for how everybody else would like to be, and you just do your thing. And we're trying to build the Living Systems Academy on our boundary. And my dream is that before I die, I'm 65 now, I'm coming on for being an older geezer, although I trust that quite a few people listening are even as old as I. And we've talked about this. Wouldn't it be great if we could have a platform where we weren't saying this is our view, but what it is trying to do is to excite people to contribute their ideas for improving things, so that one can create a kind of a place that can, I know it's a bit of a cliche, so forgive me, a place that can ground the lightning of a large number of people's aspirations, so that you can start to see how we can unweave some of the unpleasant things and create opportunity and growth without it being about products and consumerism, but is more about happiness, beauty and general well-being and a more greater equitable world. Gosh, this sounds like a kind of pulpit speech. But the purpose of this first speech between us was to actually get a whole bunch of people involved in the discussion, feeling that, look, we don't have the answers, but we've got an idea for a platform where we can... Yeah. Could you riff on that for a moment?
Yeah. Look, I obviously you and I are of a similar mind, or we wouldn't be kind of together in this kind of venture. But the, where I think we have to find the right balance, and I'm not sure what that is yet. I think we're looking for it. Is, when you say we don't want to be the people with the waggy little finger, too right. I mean, obviously we don't. Nobody wants to be preached to. But on the other hand, some leadership is needed, because otherwise the danger is that you have a cacophony, and whoever sort of shouts loudest just kind of has their voice heard. So there does need to be maybe some curation or some sort of basic underlying philosophy to what it is that we're trying to do, and then within that you ask people for the best ideas and you give them the platform, which is I think what you're intending. I mean, and the other thing is that at some point we need leadership, and on things which are really, really critical, like climate change, which is potentially an existential threat to humanity and to everything else. We need, unfortunately, because I'm not a great fan of big government, but unfortunately we need governments to do things, because it means mass changes in behaviour, and we might need carbon taxes, we might need rationing of some kind of things if we leave it too long. And it needs thoughtful, strong leadership, which means not necessarily telling people what they want to hear, but having the charisma and the guts and the grit to be able to convince people to go along with you, even if it's not what they really want to do. That's one bit of leadership. Another one is, are they going to be trusted without fear or favour to do the right thing? And to know that we're all in this together, both us as a community in the UK, but also other governments need to trust each other. So all those things that you need from leadership kind of in a way need to be reflected in a way, in the way that we act, I think.
Yes. Well, we're painfully aware as the Eden Project that you can get sort of smug about being better than a lot of other people in terms of the way you do your energy or whatever, and suddenly a day dawns and you realise you're yesterday's person. You've actually got too smug. Everything is, you're off the pace, and you cease thinking and striving. And I think that's actually for us what the next phase of our lives is about, actually challenging ourselves to be as good as we can be. I remember that when we had Bill McDonough, the architect, talking at the Royal Society for us last year, he said, why is it that people who want to compromise and be pragmatic always talk about doing better? Why can't they just talk about doing good as opposed to less bad? And I think that is the stage of where we want to be. I have got to let Rose in at this point. That's terrible, isn't it? I shouldn't have the last word. You know what? I'm going to let Rose in 30 seconds, because I want to know, before the end of this, author of the Round the World in 80 Trees, what is your favourite tree?
God. Well, other than the cedar, which we lost to lightning, I'm going to answer in the way politicians do, a slightly different question, which is, a 9-year-old once asked me in one of the talks I gave, if you were a tree, what tree would you like to be? And I said I'd like to be the quiver tree, which is in the aloe family, like aloe vera, but it's a huge tree. which is the national tree of Namibia. And the reason I'd like to be that tree is not because it's kind of fantastically resilient and it thrives in a desert where nothing else can grow, but because it's the national tree of Namibia. People sort of smile when they see it. It's a bit like driving a Morris Minor. And the second reason that I'd like to be that tree is that it's coated with a sort of ultraviolet, a sort of material, a waxy powder that reflects ultraviolet light, but it makes it very, very tactile, so that when people see it, they not only smile, but they want to kind of touch it in a very friendly way. And I think that's the tree I would like to be.
So you'd actually like to have lots of people touch you whenever you smile in a friendly way. Excellent. What a great way to end up the interview. We've actually had a bit freaky, doesn't it? It's had a bit freaky. Rose, come in, my dear. I'm sorry for the slightly shambolic performance, at least on my side. John has been a paragon of virtue.
No, you've both been really interesting, and thank you for soldiering on through the technical hiccups. That was really much appreciated. I've got a couple of, we've had some really interesting questions come in, and we've tried to, where there's been common themes, just combine them a little bit. So it's another tree question that we'd love to put to John, but Tim, if you've also got some thoughts, we'd love to hear those. So given climate change, what advice could you give on species of tree for us to plant or preserve, which will be able to survive and not struggle over the course of their expected lifespan? So we're thinking about what trees can cope with the future.
Do you mean, excuse me, do you mean the tree's expected lifespan or John's?
Comes to the same thing, Tim.
Okay, so climate change is very difficult for trees because first of all, you've got changes in the amount of water and the amount of and what temperature they are. So the actual species may find that difficult. Second thing is that all the critters that it depends on, all the little insects that it needs to pollinate it, all the little animals that go and scurry off with seeds in order to disperse it and make the next generation. Those may be affected by climate change, and they may be sort of available at the wrong times. So everything gets thrown out of kilter. It's not just that things get harmed, it's the fact that they're not all there at the same time, which makes a complicated ecosystem fall apart. And thirdly, we are more open to invasive species. So things can suddenly survive in a warmer climate or a wetter climate, and they come from other places and invade.
Sorry, isn't that excuse me, Mr. Drori, is that not a rather racist comment about invasive species? I mean, if I was a Himalayan balsam, I would actually think this is a nice place, and I might breed with the rest of them, and I'll have a really nice life. Remember the Angles and the Saxons?
So the thing about human beings is that absolutely the more the merrier, and I'm the product of an invasive species, and the reason I live in London is because we're all here and it's lovely, and I love all that. When you bring plants and animals, particularly insects, into the country, they can sort of throw everything a bit out of balance. So we have to be a bit careful about that. It's a thing to watch. Now, the question was about, in the light of all that, what species should you plant? And first of all, the things that you should be planting are, other than sort of the odd flower in your garden and so on, we're thinking native species where they have grown up with the insects and animals that we've got. So rather than bringing in something that will just sort of stand on its own, you want to create these ecosystems that are robust. So the native species. And then we might start thinking about taking some of the genetic material for those native species. Instead of planting oaks just from the UK, we might think, well, we might want to plant some oak trees if we've imported them in a good way and they're not bringing disease with them. We might want to take some of those acorns, breed them from maybe the south of France or places which are a bit further south where we think that's the kind of climate that we're going to get. Sorry, long answer.
No, it's a great answer. Great answer. But you've got to be careful.
You're eating.
So I'm having a peanut because I thought he's going to talk a long time. I can get a peanut down. That's what I thought. Look, you don't get that on Parkinson. Let's be honest. I know that. But I have to just interrupt you for a minute. I am. You don't know this. I am a co-patron with Michael Eavis of the British Black Honeybee Association. And one of the really interesting thing is, did you know that one of the real problems of the ecology of Britain and the honeybee is those shagging Italian bees that are brought over to come and do a bit of pollination in like Kent and in the glasshouses of Kent, and then they escape, and then they have it away with our black bees, and then what happens is genetically they get weak and they can't handle the winters. You've got to be careful.
So there's another question here on your. I'm just looking at the questions that people have sent in, and
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt that.
No. It's on the subject. It's on the bees thing, because Paul has sent in a question: is there an insect that the world can't afford to lose? And obviously there's the bees and the kind of crazy amount of insecticides that we use that we're gradually learning about that are damaging them, and the bees we depend on for pollination. But when you start kind of looking more and more closely, you realise how many of the things that we take for granted really depend on little insects that get no credit. All the chocolate in the world depends on these tiny little midges that you can barely see, that go from plant to plant to pollinate them. And it's extraordinary. The vanilla that we have, all of that vanilla that doesn't grow in South America, which is South and Central America, which is where it sort of originally came from, Central America. All of that has to be hand pollinated. So all the vanilla we get from Madagascar, there's people that go around splodging the flowers together. And we're going to see more of that, unfortunately.
Wow, that's amazing. I tell you what, if I was a Ghanaian tiny midge, I'd vote you in as president. Just saying.
I think that's a great compliment. Not one that I've had before.
Sorry, Rose.
No, that's fine. I've got time for just one more question, and it feels like we can't not mention it because it's one of the reasons we're all sat separately in our own houses. But does the current pandemic crisis and us emerging from it provide us with an opportunity to make natural history get into the bloodstream of everyone? And if so, how do we do this? And that's for both of you, I suppose.
Wow. John, you go. No, I'll go first. I'll tell you why. Because I think John's been such a splendid gift. I'd like him to have the last word. I will say very simply, yes. Anybody who has had access to the green stuff during this lockdown, my heart goes out to all of those who haven't. So I'm excluding them from this part of the debate. Those who've actually had a chance to look at the green stuff, or been getting out of their prison and isolation to see the green stuff, if it hasn't moved you, if it hasn't made you think, if it hasn't made you believe that actually we ought to live in a different way, I think all of you who believe that should fry. And those that then survive will be able to survive on a planet that is robbed of people who don't understand that the natural world is fantastic. By the way, my tongue was in my cheek before anybody starts quoting me back at me as being a genocidal, exclusive elite member of the Natural History Society. It's not that. It's just that you could actually be excused for thinking it was a miracle when you go outside and you hear those birds going bonkers. I mean, I'm 65. I have never in my life heard the birds so loud. When recently we were able to go onto the Camel Trail, which is actually a bike trail, which is just over the river from us, about 100 yards away, and seen so many insects. I've never seen so many insects, all sort of coming around. And I'm thinking, we're not doomed, but going back to the beginning of this program when John and I were talking about politics and stuff, some of us need to throw our political baggage, our certainties out and say, what would the world be like if we pretended that we were starting all over, just looking at the way the natural world is and saying, wow, we've got a chance to really, really kick on now if we stop holding on to those stupid views. As you drive into Wales, there's some graffiti on a warehouse as you go over the Severn Bridge, which is absolutely cracking. Some open mines should be closed for repair. And I think if we actually manage to open our minds, and I include myself and everybody who believes what I believe, because we've got our own prejudices, if we could actually park them up, we could have a real chance of having a very exciting next 50 years. John, please end with the march of the slaves from Aida.
Look, the danger is that human beings are programmed to fight or flight, and unless we use our brains as well as our reflexes, we might not recognise the urgency of dealing with climate change, and we might revert because it's comfortable to something that we know, even though the thing that we revert to we also know is damaging. So the kind of the very sort of the hard thing in this is how can we as a society migrate to a world, how do we transition to a world which is not based on increasing consumption of stuff, and yet where people feel happy and fulfilled, and they have things to do that they enjoy, that we're not all wearing hair shirts and suffering, but the way that the society is built at the moment, which is all predicated or largely predicated on the growth of companies and the growth of largely linked to the growth in consumption actually. How do we move to something else in a way which isn't kind of a horrid transition, but is a nice transition? And some businesses will go out of business, but other ones will start. It's like a kind of it's like those sort of environmental niches for plants. Something changes as we move to a low carbon economy. Yes, some things will go out of business, but other things will start. Some things that we enjoy and have fun with will stop, but other sorts of fun will start. So there is a big opportunity, and I think the question is, how do we, rally people to sort of, I hate the word activism, but how do you get people to kind of grip this en masse in a way which is going to make the world a better place and an enjoyable one for more people? Without kind of backsliding. I think that's the question.
John, what an unbelievable pleasure and privilege to have you on our first webinar. And I bet you there's an awful lot of people in the audience tonight who, if they were making a choice of people they would wish they could have at their kitchen table. Oh, and he's actually, that's a bit of cheap marketing. I have to say, I have to say, this is not a plug. I have read every word of that book, and it is marvellous. Now shut up. What I wanted to say was, I hope the audience who've watched this evening would all agree that if they were having a dinner party for a special occasion in their kitchen, not in some poncy smart place, but a place where they wanted to get well and truly have a few bottles of wine or beer down the neck and some interesting conversation, he's your man. Good night, everybody.
Tim, you're a force for good in the world. Thank you.
Hey, ciao.
Just to both of you, I just want to say thank you so much for your time this evening and for sharing your kitchen table with everyone who's here joining us. Just a quick note to everyone here, if you've already submitted a question but we didn't answer it, then don't worry, we'll put the questions to Tim and John a little bit later on, and if they can, we'll get some written responses to you along with the recording of this going on. And also, as Tim mentioned, this is our first one, so if anyone's had any feedback or thoughts, please do get in touch with me. I'm very happy to get your comments. We're hopefully lining up another guest for Tim in the near future, and we will let you know about that.
We'd love to know how to improve, wouldn't we? Please, we don't want people to tell us how great we are. We want people to say, look, we want you to say, we quite like that. You could improve it with a bit of this and a bit of that, whatever.
Yeah, give us ideas. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, so thank you very much. And just as a note from my role as looking after membership and fundraising at Eden, whilst Eden remains temporarily closed, I'd just like to direct you to our website, edenproject.com. It's got some really amazing resources on there that you can use to educate at home, learn more about what we're doing. And also there's a page on there called edenproject.com/donate. And you may already be a supporter, member or patron. If you are, I'd just like to say a really huge thank you for your support, which we're so grateful for. But if not, if you are able to support us either with a small donation or by joining and becoming a member, we'd love to have you. And we'll be doing more of these and we'll let you know about those in due course. So thank you so much. And yeah, huge thank you to Tim and John. You've been amazing. Thank you.
So have you, Rose. Well done, you.
Thank you
Goodbye.
very much.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.